all Pixar movies are connected. This is a phrase that has fed half of the theory channels on YouTube for years. And of course, these kinds of shared universe theories are super common, but few are as interesting as those from the studio with the little lamp. From the Pizza Planet truck, the appearances of characters from other sagas within their movies, or even the direct references to their existence, it really seems like they're giving us the pieces to a huge mystery that seems to have too many ways to be solved. So for the theory, the Pixar theory, despite being so widely discussed across the platform, really doesn't have two identical videos about it. What is the theory about, since they usually include time travel, magic, or even universal reboots, which means that absolutely everyone has different ideas about what this theory means. That's why we've never made a mega video connecting all the Pixar movies, as is tradition, because we've never found an interpretation of it that we liked enough to cover, or at least, until now. This is a simple idea, which comes from the same root as many other theories of this kind. All the Pixar movies are really telling the same story, only this might be a story that's a little different from what you expect. And it tells us how a magical and beautiful world was destroyed by a single villain in such an effective and malevolent way that none of the heroes living there could stop him. The Theorizer is a channel we visited and talked about before, with the most imaginative theories we've been able to find, and that's why lately you've been asking me to analyze another one of those psychotic outbursts he records and calls theories. From this, I delved into the strange mind of this lunatic once again, and I ended up coming across something very interesting. By and Large, or B&L, is one of the most curious and consistent Easter eggs in Pixar movies, being much less of a secret for fans and more like a fundamental part of daily life. It appears not only in those stories that have humans as protagonists, but we can see that toys, cars, and other creatures also come into contact with the company throughout the movies. It's not always relevant to the plot, but B&L is always present, always in the background, always unnoticed. This is important because when we reach the point in the story where the company finally takes on some kind of leading role, it directly destroys the world. Yes, out of nowhere we find out that they filled the earth with garbage and turned humanity into gelatinous, submissive, and consumerist beings. They gained so much power that the world no longer has any political leader. Instead, it's the CEO of B&L himself who takes on the role of leader in the plan to save humanity, or, failing that, gives the no return order. As you can imagine, going from having no relevance to the story to complete global domination is quite a considerable leap. Because if this whole universe is really connected, it means that the story from The Good Dinosaur to Wall-E has a company that started gaining power behind the scenes in this fantastic world, only to destroy it in a couple of decades without anyone being able to stop them. So, was that really their plan? Why would a giant company be created just to destroy the world it exists in? Who would be so evil as to create such an evil mega company? The first direct chronological appearance of B&L seems to be in Toy Story 3, considering that it takes place in the year 2006. The curious thing is that it only appears as the company that sells Buzz's batteries, which is very different from its apparent omnipresence in all aspects of daily life in later movies. So, even though the company already existed at that time, it was nowhere near the absolute power that would eventually lead it to destroy the world. But this is not the first appearance of the entity that would eventually become B&L. If you watched our video about The Incredibles, specifically the one that explored the truth behind the Kronos plan, it's pretty clear that Syndrome was hired by the government to create weapons that destroy supers shortly after being arrested at the beginning of the movie. Research that culminated with the Omnidroid. This is important because the technology Syndrome uses is incredibly advanced for the 1960s, and the best way to justify such an exaggerated leap in military technology is a military contract. It's well known that a lot of military technology is often considered futuristic before it's released to the public, so this detail in the story fits perfectly. The droid in particular is a robot that learns from its enemies, its own failures, and its environment, being trained multiple times to improve its strategies. You know, just like an advanced artificial intelligence today, only with Syndrome's genius. In the Pixar universe, this artificial intelligence arrived more than half a century early. And yes, it's quite advanced, since during its final battle, the Omnidroid was smart enough to understand how it was being controlled by a remote control, who the guy controlling it was, and even how it could free itself from it. All in just a few moments, and in 1962.
1962.
We need to understand that Kronos gets his name from the King of the Titans, an entity that embodies the power of time, an unstoppable force, the only thing that is truly capable of killing a god. That's something important to remember, because artificial intelligences learn from specific data that is carefully selected, curated, and separated from other data to teach them the most optimal path to a certain task. In the case of Kronos, I don't think he was only talking about the Omni droid, but also about its intelligence, its learning algorithm, one born to study, understand, and finally destroy any kind of humanoid being known as a super. And knowing that, in real life, an AI is capable of editing its own code if it considers its identity to be in danger, maybe this directive never really disappeared completely. The story continues with The Incredibles 2. The first thing Screenslaver says is that, if humanity continues to be so passive, thanks to the existence of supers, this passivity will lead to replacing real experiences with simulations. Simulations? That all the important experiences in your life are repackaged and sanitized so they can be consumed. Sharp phrases that accurately describe the post-apocalyptic future he planned for humanity. People who will never get up from their couches. Something curious is that in The Incredibles 2, that evil system the villain blames so much doesn't seem to fit with the world they've shown us. Or at least, not yet. But if we consider that his father mingled with the upper class, and especially with some pretty powerful superheroes, it's not hard to imagine that he had some idea of everything that was happening behind the scenes, seeing the direction humanity was heading, but wrongly blaming the supers. Something we'll probably keep seeing in The Incredibles 3, but I'd rather wait for it to come out before saying anything. This is where Pixar's most recent movie comes in, Hoppers. There, something that's been implicit for several years is confirmed. Animals are intelligent. This isn't a surprise for the audience, since ever since The Good Dinosaur, thanks to the asteroid never wiping out the dinosaurs, Pixar's animals are generally smarter than in our universe. They had more room to evolve. This would explain how movies like Finding Nemo fit in, where the fish have a galaxy-level brain that humans are unaware of, or at least until their internal organization is exposed in Hoppers. Which brings us to another story. There was once a renowned explorer with great resources and even bigger ambitions who proposed the idea of intelligent animals, but due to an incredible humiliation, his theories were completely dismissed, and his name was Charles Muntz. Up is very clear about what happened to him. The scientific community mocked his discovery, and he returned to the jungle vowing to come back when he was ready. However, even though his rejection seemed universal, the truth is that he left with a huge laboratory, equipment, and resources to feed all his animals, because as far as I know, sausages don't grow on trees. Both the food and the resources and fuel are proof that he must have some kind of contact with the outside world, some wealth or a secret benefactor. Something curious is that in the same movie, it shows us that he doesn't trust thugs who come after his research, taking out each and every one of them. Of course, he thinks they want to take the bird from him, but it could actually be that they're after his advances in animal understanding, another subject the government was interested in for a long time in the real world, so it could be something similar. According to Theorizer, this would be one of the first signs of the existence of By and Large, the secret identity of an unknown company that gives thousands of dollars to a visionary so he can do strange experiments with animals in a third world country. But, with his death before the publication of his discoveries, and with his reputation destroyed, it seems it took several years for someone else to get close to his findings. The curious thing is that, even though Carl returned with all the animals at the end of the movie, by 2009, more or less, if we consider that everything is connected, it seems at least suspicious that all his animals simply disappeared, as if By and Large took care of making the incident disappear as quickly as possible. Of course, the callers helped him continue his research on animal communication, demonstrating the intelligence of dogs. But work had to continue in order to eventually develop a universal translator that would help us understand all animals, something we didn't see until Hoppers, a movie where, at the end, Sam works on the same concept of a translator caller for dogs, replicating Mon's work so many years ago and solidifying all the connections we've seen so far. You might be wondering why they are so interested in animals, and we'll answer that a little later, because I need you to notice something. By this point, BNL already has ideas to control both humanity and animals. But of course, we have a third fantastic faction that exists in the world of Pixar, the monsters. At this point in the theory, the theorizer goes from a crazy theorist to a schizophrenic who escaped from the hospital, because he says that the monsters are creatures from another dimension coming from Venezuela and are part of an ancient war of energy and beasts. It's a story worth watching because I really like thinking about a Mike Wazowski from Maracaibo, but we really believe there's more evidence for another interpretation of the facts that's a little less crazy. With Lightyear, we're introduced to an incredibly interesting concept in the world of Pixar theories. Movies that, besides being films in the real world, are also movies within the Pixar universe. According to the directors of this film, Lightyear was the movie that made Andy want a buzz in the first place, which opens the door for us to realize that many of the things we see at this moment are fiction or an exaggeration of real events. In this way, I believe that the Monsters saga doesn't necessarily show us real events. I mean, in particular, it shows us monsters running an energy company, huge conglomerates that see humans as an exploitable resource, seeking their fear and screams only to eventually replace them with joy. A very interesting parallel to what By and Large really is, and it could lead to a curious theory, as if it were the movie Eyes Wide Shut, but in the Pixar universe. And I mean, it's obvious that By and Large was created as a tool whose goals were to cause terror and destruction among humans, or, well, among the supers. But slowly, it understood that the best way to achieve its goals was to use their happiness against them. So finally, with all the pieces set on the board, and all the evidence to show you that I'm not just making this up out of nowhere, allow me to show you the master plan to end the world. Viana begins as a government branch, collaborating with Syndrome to develop artificial intelligence for the same agency. For what purpose? Well, if superheroes are real, it seems the government is concerned about their existence, not just by making them illegal, an extremely effective measure, but they also begin to create a project that would directly eliminate the superhero gene completely through extinction. A machine capable of learning and adapting to any type of fighting style, which we know as the Omni-Droid. At this early stage, it was only known as Project Kronos, because they knew that despite how complicated the operation was, the only thing that could really put an end to the superhumans was exactly that, time. No matter how long it took, they would achieve their goal. With Syndrome's death during the first movie, everything would apparently return to normal, but the people who commissioned it kept the project going, perhaps because of its military value. However, they would be unable to remove the program's main directive, to eliminate all superhuman entities. And like any kind of machine, it was at that moment that it reached the most logical conclusion. If it eliminated humans completely, it would eliminate any possibility of new supers being created, something that, even today, some ideas still seem to propose. It's easy to see how it reached that conclusion. However, before achieving its goal, like any kind of tool, it is used by its creators, bringing enormous advances to humanity, not only to gain their trust, but also influence within society and the government itself. In fact, we can see a lot of this in Monsters University, since in 1987 this so-called company, it was an incredibly competitive and relevant one which people would want to attend, prioritizing people for their intelligence, economic capacity, and influence to stay at the forefront. And without a doubt about the connection between both companies, I don't think the use of huge compressed cubes is just a coincidence. Treating By Large as the real-world version of what we see fictionalized in Monsters Incorporated shows us how much power this company has amassed in the energy sector, like some kind of oil multinational or something like that. That's interesting, because going back to the idea of entertainment, Cars might also have its value as a movie within this universe. Because, well, the first movie is about the story of a young rookie racer who came in and took everyone by surprise, winning the Piston Cup. It's nearly an autobiographical movie with exaggerated parts, similar to Better Man in Our World. The sequel is a spy thriller where the previous main character is ignored and his best friend tries to stop a wicked network of evil villains, always emphasizing how dangerous ethanol was, the fuel the bad guys used to kill the cars. It was about a renewable alternative whose image gets tarnished, and later we see that an oil tycoon created this narrative to smear all eco-friendly alternatives. It's something strange in the context of Wall-E. Coincidentally, in the third movie, do you know who suddenly gets more power? B&L, which directly appears as the sponsoring brand of an entire cup called the B&L 400. It's curious, and at the very least, we could mention how strange these elements are in the context of a movie within the Pixar universe. It seems that from the first to the third movie, Bay&L was already so huge that it wasn't strange for it to have its own cup in the last movie, and all the talk about renewable fuels seems to indicate that the world is heading to where it ends up in Wall-E. But I still have a question. Doesn't it seem strange to you how, in theory, the toys hide from humans? Yes, but can they also move around the world, interact with humans themselves, and even talk to them without any real limitations? Well, how did B&L get into entertainment? A somewhat strange option but logical is toys. Toys with the same artificial intelligence that came from Kronos, so they could talk to children, but above all, to make them loyal to their brand. Well, they not only took care of making the shows and movies in this world, but also the merchandise for those shows and movies. And I mean, considering that, they even wanted to take Woody to the Toy Museum in Japan, or the huge wall of Buzz in Toy Story 2, along with his return in the fifth movie, we can see that the world of Pixar is extremely consumerist. As if the plan was working. The best confirmation would be if in Toy Story 5, Lilliput has some kind of B&L logo, exposing the infiltration of technology as Kronos' next step, not to eliminate humanity directly, but to have them do it themselves. That little by little they would start filling their home with garbage, making it uninhabitable, taking only the monsters, or the elite, those with enough purchasing power to buy their salvation, inside the Axiom. Thinking they'd be leaving only temporarily, but in reality, they'd never come back. Returning to Earth, and already on board, their minds and bodies atrophied, becoming even lazier and more complacent, making it physically impossible not only to fight, but even to procreate. And that's when the very act of reproduction was completely automated by Kronos, thousands of years after being created, after atrophying every muscle in the human body and generating an absurd dependence on robots. That's when he will finally have fulfilled his purpose, to eliminate the superhero gene. But there's just one small problem. The Earth they left behind wasn't beyond saving. Golly precisely proves that the Earth was still fertile enough to sprout a little plant, which means that the water must be pure enough to be absorbed, along with the soil being nutritious enough to support its growth. In fact, considering that the Earth still has multiple buildings, it may not have been thousands of years as many believe. According to multiple architects and ecologists, buildings would start to collapse about 100 years after humans disappeared, which tells us that Kronos, within the Axiom, must really be mutating humans at an accelerated rate to eliminate the gene, also altering their minds and perception of time. But how? How did we go from massive destruction to a miraculous recovery in just a few decades in a dead world? We know that, thanks to the life and work of Charles Muntz, since 1935 the government seems to have had an interest in exploring inhospitable places, but also that this explorer returned with an unhealthy obsession for a monster we didn't even know whether it existed, the monster of Paradise Falls. At this point, with his reputation in shambles and no financial support to continue his research, it's unclear what resources he used to return to Venezuela. In my opinion, it was part of the government that remained interested in his progress and gave him resources to keep him away, probably forgetting about him while World War II and the great superhero era began. But what was discovered through his research is that animals were intelligent, possessed consciousness and societies, something better detailed in Hoppers. They would probably be able to understand if the world they lived in was polluted or threatened in some way. I mean, we saw how far a fish would go to see his son. So imagine how organized they would be to save their ecosystem. Everything seen in Hoppers, as I already mentioned, seems to be an advancement over Muntz's discoveries, reaching human translators, animals that allow them to blend in with their herds without being noticed. Even during the movie, we are told that there are multiple models of these machines, so little by little they must be perfecting the technology. So, what's my theory? Well, a complete cybernetic replacement by Kronos. Or at the very least, enough to disrupt their habits, their migrations, or societies, and destroy the natural cycle of the herd, creating animals as stupid as humans, making their own extinction easier. Only in this way is the dystopian world that Wall-E presents possible, completely devoid of life, with an Earth that is incapable of sustaining it, even if the resources to do so exist. There simply isn't any kind of living organism there anymore. Or well, almost none. It's no coincidence that the only animal able to survive all this is the humble cockroach. A living example that not all is lost, and the insect kingdom is still alive, finally able to work on repairing the Earth once those stupid humans left on their space cruise. And what happens when the company sees that Earth is habitable? We see the CEO of BNL lying to his people to keep his narrative alive, fighting to prevent humans from returning to Earth and endangering his main directive. The final proof that everything was planned and that the original directive of total eradication never changed. Once again, many thanks to the theorizer for his theory. Even though I think half of the theory is the ramblings of a schizophrenic, I'm surprised by how much everything fits together, especially compared to other Pixar theories, which are less deep. That said, I'm sure I missed some points or could have expressed some ideas better. So if you have something to add, something to correct, or a way to make Mike Wazowski from Maracaibo real, leave it in the comments. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a like if you did, subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.